Hello, and welcome to Your Estate Matters with your hosts, my colleague Greg Bernand and myself, Nicole Garten of Heritage Trust.
Your Estate Matters is a podcast dedicated to everything estates, including building and preserving your legacy.
If it's estate related, we'll be talking about it. We're having the conversations today that will help Canadians protect their families, their assets, and their legacies tomorrow.
Jim, thanks for being here with us today to talk about fine art appraisal. Tell us about yourself, Jim, and how you got into fine and decorative art appraisal and appraising.
It's a long story. I'm always a little bit intimidated by this question because I'm not sure what I should be divulging about myself. Born in Salisbury, Southern Rhodesia, what is now Harare, Zimbabwe, and arrived in Canada in the mid-60s, settled with my parents in Hamilton, Ontario. Many years later, entered school, was trained as an architectural technologist originally, and was in industry for maybe 10 years or so. Then I decided to go back to school, back to McMaster, got my degrees in art and art history and fine art studio, with the intent of pursuing a career in art. Relocated to BC about 30 odd years ago. Through a series of events, became a member of the ISA, which is the International Society of Appraisers, fine art specialist, which is an appraisal. It's a professional appraisal organization based in the US. Took their online courses, became accredited, and set up my own business as an art appraiser, fine art appraiser, and that was 2005. Returned to school, got my master's from SFU in contemporary art, for no other reason than my competitors had master's degrees, so I thought to be competitive I would do the same, which is what I did. I've been in business since 2005, roughly 20 years. Appraise vintage, Canadian, American, antique, contemporary, European, etc., etc. Basically anything that comes my way, I appraise.
Right, and is it generally when you're approached, is it single items or is it more often a collection of items specifically?
It's a collection of items. I do have individuals who have single items that they would like to sort of get an idea as to what the value is, either for insurance purposes or for fair market value for resale. I do divorce cases. People are getting divorced and they want to know the value of the artwork collection that they have. I do insurance appraisals as well. But I would say generally it's people with collections that contact me. In other words, they're people that have been collecting for years and know, or at least have a general idea as to the value of their collection, the content of their collection. And generally speaking, I would say those are most of my clients.
So you've got a really interesting and varied background. For anyone that's interested in this area, what is the requirement for education and credentials to do what you do?
First of all, become a member of the ISA and take their core course in appraisal studies course, as well as their USPAP course, which is the Unified Standards of Personal Property Appraisal. Once you've sort of reached that level, then the requirement is to demonstrate that you have proficiency in a particular discipline, a particular area. The ISA actually has members who are, they're right across the board as far as items that they appraise, everything from furniture to automobiles, fine art, etc. So yeah, you would become credentialed in your particular specialty. University courses usually. Also a requirement for years of service, if you will. In other words, years of practice as an ISA appraiser. I'm obliged to requalify every 5 years to maintain my accredited membership in this organization, which I don't think any other professional organization has such a requirement. I also take the USPAP courses every 2 years. That's kind of sort of an upgrading and updating of that particular document. So the ISA sort of has set itself apart from other professional appraisal organizations in the sense that education is extremely important. Ongoing education, very important to sort of keep appraisers up to date and keep them current.
So refresh my memory. What does the acronym ISA stand for again?
It stands for the International Society of Appraisers. It's actually one of 3 American appraisal organizations. There's also the AAA, which is the American Association of Appraisers, and the ASA, the American Society of Appraisers.
What are the main areas or disciplines that people do?
Well, it's mainly fine art. I would say overwhelmingly fine art. Here in Canada, I don't know how many appraisers we have, but the large majority are based in Toronto and they're fine art based. There are several ISA members across the country, mostly concentrated in the large metropolitan areas, such as Toronto, and Vancouver to a certain extent.
So I was going to ask that, is this a niche discipline or are there many of you?
There are many of us. It is a niche discipline. As I say, with most fine art members or fine art appraisers being concentrated in Toronto, Vancouver, and maybe out east. There might be a couple of them out east, that sort of thing. You can actually search the ISA Canada website for members, their locations, their specialties, et cetera, et cetera.
So I think that segues, Jim, into about the process and cost and timeline required to engage a fine art appraiser. So you just said you can go to the website, but when they make contact with you or some other member of that society or the appraisal group, what is the process?
Well, it's actually kind of a question and answer process initially. I have to find out why they want an appraisal. That's the reason, the intended use, let's say, of the appraisal, whether it be for insurance, for fair market value for resale, or they just want to sort of get an idea, sort of an oral idea as to what the value of a painting might be. So once I know the answer to those questions, then I can sort of delve in a little deeper, ask questions about the collection, about the content of the collection, provenance, any provenance that they may have on their artworks. In other words, provenance, kind of a history of ownership, where the pieces came from, whether it be by descent or by purchase from a gallery or another collector, let's say. So once I have all that information, the next thing is to do a site visit. Usually go to the sites, take images of the pieces, collect data such as the media, the size, any provenance that the owner may have, that sort of thing, and then go home, go back to my office and do the appraisal and send a PDF off to the client, the completed appraisal. I would say over the years, people who collect fine art they're very happy to talk about their collection. They're very sort of involved in their collection personally, if you will, because understandably, if you purchase a piece of fine art, you have an engagement, a connection with the piece on a personal level, and I find owners are quite happy to sort of share that experience with me, an aesthetic experience, let's say, that they had when they bought the piece. It's kind of a very sort of personal relationship, I guess, to a certain extent, that I set up with my clients. And I enjoy that. I really do. I enjoy meeting people, talking to people about their collections. Quite happy to do that.
So I read an article in the New York Times recently about the phenomena of consultants. So I understand it's, I guess, a niche practice, but families or collectors can hire consultants to help them create a collection or source, I guess, art. Do you ever work in that capacity?
Not particularly, no, not specifically. I have acted as a consultant for other reasons. One that sort of comes to mind is something that I'm involved in right now, where I have a client who has sold a painting to an overseas buyer, and we've applied to the export review board to have the paint, or in other words, get a clearance, if you will, to allow the painting to leave the country and go to its international purchaser. We applied for an export permit, were refused, so we've decided to appeal to what's known as the CCPERB, which is the Canadian Cultural Property Export Review Board. And they're sort of the gatekeepers of what I would loosely term as Canadian culture. They sort of regulate the movement of artworks which, in their opinion, demonstrate outstanding significance and national importance to the Canadian mosaic. So we're in the process right now of, we've made the application for appeal. I have written the statement for appeal to the CCPERB, and they will have a meeting, I believe, the end of March, and then they'll determine whether or not the piece can receive a permit for export. If not, the painting is then offered to a Canadian museum for possible purchase. And if the museum in Canada wants to purchase it, they can do so. If not, the CCPERB will probably, or hopefully, issue the export permit. So my capacity in all this is as a consultant, not so much as a consultant on curating or offering advice on creating a collection, but more of a consultant in the sense that we're sort of trying to facilitate the purchase of this painting by an international client.
So, what's the criteria to have national cultural importance, if that's the correct term? Clarify the correct term?
I'm glad you asked me that question, Nicole. It's pretty involved. The bottom line is that it's up to the discretion of the review board, that is the CCPERB. There is no sort of definitive answer to that question. It's their collective consensus, I guess, amongst themselves as to what that means. Open to interpretation. It's completely up to them. As an example, an auction house here in Vancouver just sold a painting by Gustave Caboyet entitled Blue Irises. This, well, not just sold, but we're going back maybe 5 years or so ago to a client in London, I believe it was. It's actually a commercial gallery in London. And they applied to the review board for an export permit. They were turned down. They appealed and to a judicial review. They were successful in their appeal. From there, it went to the federal court, I believe, and the federal court sided with the initial decision made by CCPERB, such that the export permit was not issued. So the painting was offered to the AGO, Art Galleries of Ontario, for possible purchase, which they did. They purchased the painting with the help of a program offered by the federal government known as the Movable Cultural Property Grant which the public gallery can apply for to purchase such a painting, which they did. So this painting, which was painted by a French artist in the late 19th century, no connection with Canada whatsoever. But the CCPERB determined that, yes, indeed, it has outstanding significance and national importance to the Canadian mosaic, and as such, it has remained here in Canada. Now, Nicole, you're a lawyer, and I can send you links to, actually, the auction house here in Vancouver hired a lawyer to sort of argue its case. I can send you the link, the legal firm and their approach to it, etc. It's very interesting reading, very interesting indeed. So that's something that, as I say, I do as well.
So if somebody owns, say, like a group of 7 or a Bill Reed sculpture or something, what I'm hearing is it's unlikely that they can sell it to someone outside of Canada.
Yes, I would say that's probably true. It depends. There again on the interpretation made by the review board as to whether or not it has OSNI.
That's an interesting question because the cultural importance piece, what about restraint of trade and property rights? And it's an interesting dichotomy of issues.
In this particular case that I was talking about with my client, she does not want the painting to stay in Canada. She wants it to go to the clients in Europe. And if the AGO comes to her to purchase it, she can, say, well, no, I don't want to sell it to the AGO. If the AGO wants to purchase it, they can certify it under CPERB. In doing so, that certification allows for a tax relief, tax benefit for the seller. So it's sort of a little bit of an incentive for her to sell to the AGO because she gets the tax benefit.
So what would be the reason why someone might want a purchaser in Europe versus an art gallery in Canada?
Well, the auction house example that I just talked about, in that particular case, the painting was purchased by a gallery, commercial gallery in London, England. So they probably bought it for resale. In other words, they had a buyer somewhere, and they were going to sell it to them. The case that I'm talking about, the client is a museum in Europe. They have a curatorial focus on works by this particular artist. As a matter of fact, the advisor to the museum is a world authority on artworks by this particular artist. So my client wants the painting to go back to that museum where she knows it'll be displayed, it'll be on exhibition, it'll be a focus of research for that particular artist. So it's not the typical being purchased by a commercial gallery for resale. It's going back to a public institution in Europe.
Those sound like favorable facts for your case.
Well, I hope so. We have a scheduled oral presentation prior to CPERB making its decision, which will include the co-director of the museum, the owner, myself, and also the world authority on this particular artist, sort of in a little group chat, trying to convince CPERB to let this painting go.
So Jim, that was a kind of a very unique case that I'm sure most of us didn't know this was required, but nor should be necessarily. What are some interesting cases that you might have encountered over the years yourself in your appraisal history?
I've actually made a little bit of a list here. I'm sort of going through it. One of the more interesting was that I did a Victoria Cross. This is a little bit outside of my specialty, but I was asked to do it, and I did indeed do it. This was a Victoria Cross won by a Canadian soldier at Passchendaele during the First World War. One of very few Victoria Crosses that had been awarded to Canadian soldiers. The owner lived in the U.S. He was actually a descendant of the soldier, and the Victoria Cross was actually in a safety deposit box here in Vancouver, and the owner wanted it to have it insured for insurance, or appraised for insurance, prior to being on display City of Calgary City Hall. So asked me to do it. I Went down, inspected the piece, had a look at it. It had everything that it needed to have. In other words, it was not a reproduction. It was not a fake. It was the original item. And did the appraisal, of course, for insurance. And as far as I know, it went off to City Hall, City of Calgary, for display. Now, that was a little bit outside of my bailiwick, if you will, but I really enjoyed doing it because I had a little bit of prior knowledge, actually quite a bit of prior knowledge about the piece, about the soldier who it was awarded to, reviewed several books on this particular soldier, his history, background, etc. So he was a very, very cantankerous individual. Not the kind of not the kind of person you would like to invite to dinner. Apparently, very brusque and very boisterous and loud, according to the information I read. I'll just touch on a couple of others here. Insurance appraisal. I had an appraisal to do a piece by Oscar Kahane, very well-known Canadian artist, member of Painters 11, I believe. He died in 1953. Used to do illustrations for Maclean's magazine, the late 40s, early 50s. A client had purchased a piece here at auction and took it home. It was a piece on paper. It was an ink on paper piece. Took it home, and he was taking the piece out of the frame and ripped it while he was doing so. So called me in, and I did an appraisal for insurance purposes. Obviously, he had damaged it and decreased its value accordingly, by doing so. Did the appraisal for insurance. Luckily, we were able to restore it. There are paper restorers here in Vancouver who are able to do that sort of thing. So it kind of all worked out in the end. Just a little note there. With Canadian insurance companies, they usually ask for appraisal for replacement cost. They assume that the piece has been lost. They're looking for replacement costs, in other words, to make the client whole again. Doing an appraisal for insurance in the US is completely different in the sense that you appraise for certain types of loss within the appraisal, and you include those in the appraisal, which allows the adjuster to or the insurance agent or whomever to sort of make a determination as to just exactly how far they will go, gives them an idea as to where they are as far as making a decision to reimburse the client. And I'll just hit one more. Olympic posters. About 8 years ago, I believe, I was asked by the Surrey Foundation to travel to Annecy in France to view a collection of 3,000 Olympic posters, which were stored in the basement of the Imperial Palace Hotel in Annecy. And the reason being was that the Surrey Foundation was interested in perhaps acquiring part of the collection for exhibition here at one of the athletic facilities here in Surrey. And from there, it was thought that it would travel to other locations throughout BC. I believe it must have happened during the Olympics, so that would be more than 8 years ago, of course. The owner of the collection was offering it for sale. He was actually the manager of the Imperial Palace Hotel in Annecy, and as I mentioned, had the collection stored in the basement of the hotel. Also had some posters throughout the hotel, in the hallways and the suites and that sort of thing. So I went over, had a look, went down in the basement with my camera and looked at all these pieces. Extraordinary collection. I was there for about 3 days, I guess. The Surrey Foundation looked after all my costs, travel costs, and accommodation, etc. while I was there. So came back and reported to the Surrey Foundation, and from what I understand, they weren't able to sort of negotiate the funding to purchase at least part of the collection. I don't think they were going to purchase all the collection, but maybe purchase just part of it. So not sure what happened after that, but that's another kind of interesting little thing.
Well, Jim, what are some tips and best practices you have for people who own valuable or fine art to preserve its value now and for their estates?
Well, it depends what it is. Greg, if we're looking at an oil on canvas painting, keep it out of the sunlight, keep it out of direct sunlight, clean it every once in a while. By cleaning, I mean have it cleaned by a restorer. There are companies actually that will store fine art in a vault for you, if you will, sort of keep them in pristine condition for resale at a later date, more as an investment than anything else. But generally speaking, as I say, with an oil painting, keep it out of the sunlight. Items that are on paper, lithographs, for example, they're also susceptible to degradation from UV light, from sunlight. They tend to fade over time, so there again, keep them out of the sunlight. But just generally, items on paper, store them flat in a flat file. If you're not interested in hanging them up, that sort of thing. But I guess just it's basically just common sense. Don't sort of treat them as objects of treat them with respect. I guess is really what I'm getting down to. Now, as far as estates go, I'm just not sure what sort of context you're referring to, Greg. As far
Well, I think when you're looking at value for the estates, potentially would be um, they you might be considering such thing as insurance appraisals, because of course the estate would be diminished by both by losing the art and potentially the value of the art, and some beneficiary may have been gifted the piece or such. I think also that does go to the person that's living, having now possession of it, them maintaining the value. So in the future, we know art goes up and down depending on certain cycles in the economy, etc. But certainly, for instance, there might be issues with what market you're trying to sell it in and locale, because some things are worth more on the East Coast than they would be here, or in certain galleries or in certain collections. Whereas we now see things like very fine china from England, 12-piece settings, really don't hold much value because nobody's got the space for these items anymore. So I think it's just along those lines of keeping track of provenances, don't throw the paperwork
oh
out,
yes,
these
yes,
sorts of things.
yes, very much so indeed.
We had an interesting estate. She was a very noted sculptor, and we ended up with a substantial amount of items. And I remember the removal and the
documentation.
storage,
And Jim assisted us actually on that.
Mhm.
And you made lovely catalogs
Mhm.
of the work of the artist, as well as the artist was an instructor and teacher, and a lot of student works
Yes,
were in there. So it was well preserved. And that was a ranked Canadian artist, as I recall. So that's exactly what you're talking about, keeping the cultural integrity uh, for Canadian culture, I guess, from what you spoke about earlier. But that you could make those catalogs while the person is living.
yes,
I mean, it's more of a curator idea and then tying it to value. But
yes,
it was very nice, and that also allows others that if the collection were to be sold, but the family may want an itemized display of that, where you could make 5 versions of that and pass that out to people,
yes,
to remember the art.
yes, indeed. Yeah.
And then someone in our city, famous collector Bob Rennie, I think he has a very substantial collection. It would be interesting to know what the best practice would be for storage and preserving it, and what he plans to do with respect to succession. And
Bob's sort of a special case, to tell you the truth. He's I haven't seen any of his collection. I've just sort of heard about it and maybe seen images online, but he's focused, as curatorial focused, mostly on contemporary work. That generally doesn't include paintings. Could include anything really. When you have a contemporary artist expressing or creating an artwork. So that would be a project I would really enjoy doing. Would be to do a catalog of his work, of not his work but his collection. But he seems to be more kind of his interests or his tastes, I guess, are more sort of in the very wide contemporary range, let's say, which is good, which is great because it brings it brings international work to Vancouver.
So that actually might require more than one or two specialists, because it would be such a broad variety of work that somebody may not have this specialty for any large portion of that collection. At what point does a collector require perhaps a curator? So it's such a big collection that it more or less has to be maintained and make sure there's insurances on it.
Most of the collectors that I have worked with, they just purchase what they like. They have no curatorial focus whatsoever. And I'd mentioned to them that, hey, Bob, maybe you should, sort of consider focusing on one particular area for your collection. But, what I say falls on deaf ears. They're people that just, have the financial resources and just purchase what they like. They're all over the map as far as I work, to tell you the truth.
Well, another famous collector in the city, Michael O'Dane, he created his own gallery.
He did, yes.
He would have certainly professionals, I imagine, that assisted
Oh, yes,
him.
yeah. Yeah, I think he obviously did have input from, I think Ian Tom at the Vancouver Art Gallery was very instrumental in helping him create his collection.
So it's a huge responsibility, and certainly something that if you're so lucky to be able to build such a valuable collection, certainly something you need to think about in terms of what your goals are for passing that along and what that looks like. When you've got, I imagine, an art collection that substantial, you'd have to think very carefully about what your legacy goals are. And it's very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely. Mm-hmm.
So what are any final tips you can give to listeners who are maybe collectors or owners of art, and what they might think about in terms of their estates?
Having their collections appraised, of course, for estate purposes, for equitable distribution. Very important. I think it's important to have that done prior to death, if you will. Maintaining the collection, the integrity of the collection, maintaining the homogeneity of the collection, keeping the collection in good shape, if you will. Documenting provenance and maintaining provenance. Any documentation you have to support provenance, extremely important. But that's generally about it.
Well, Jim, thank you for being with us today. And where can people locate you or get a hold of you?
My website, Finlay Fine Art Appraisals. My office is here at home in Surrey. You can contact me by phone or email, text me, etc.
Great. Well, Jim, thank you so much. It's been really interesting, and we really appreciate your expertise for our listeners.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much.
Yep. Thanks.
This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered individual legal, financial, or tax advice. Make sure to consult the advisor of your choice to advise you on your own circumstances. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Your Estate Matters. If you like this podcast, make sure to follow it on your podcast platform of choice.
Whether you are planning your own estate or you're acting as executor for somebody else's, Heritage Trust can help. Partner with Heritage Trust to protect your family, your assets, and your legacy.
If you would like more information about Heritage Trust, please visit our website at heritagetrustcompany.ca.
This podcast is produced by Podfather Creative.